My boss stole my promotion and gave it to his son. I didn't quit. I became their biggest client. After 10 years of loyalty, I was passed over for a legacy hire. I started a niche consulting firm. 6 months later, my old boss is in my waiting room, begging for a contract to save his failing department. The sound of a heavy stapler hitting a desk shouldn't sound like a gunshot, but in the silence of a Sunday afternoon, it echoed through the executive floor like a final warning. I was 38 years old, and I had spent the better part of my 30s staring at the same 4 beige walls, breathing in the scent of industrial carpet cleaner and overpriced espresso. I thought I was building a cathedral. It turns out I was just digging my own grave. My life followed a rhythm that was as predictable as the ticking of the grandfather clock in Harrison's lobby. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., I would wake up before the sun, cold hardwood floor under my feet serving as my first cup of caffeine. I'd walk past my daughter's bedroom, the door cracked just enough to see the glow of her nightlight, and I'd feel a pang of guilt that I wouldn't be there to see her wake up again. My wife, Clara, would usually be in the kitchen by then, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, the steam from her mug of herbal tea swirling in the dim light. "You're staying late for the quarterly review, aren't you?" she'd ask, her voice soft, not accusing, just resigned. "Harrison needs the final projections for the board, Clara," I'd say, leaning over to kiss her forehead. She smelled like lavender and sleep. "This is the big one. If the merger goes through, I'm the next senior VP. No more 5 a.m. starts, I promise." "You've been promising that since the last merger, David," she'd say, with a small, sad smile. "Just try to be home for dinner. I'm making the roast you like." I'd nod, grab my briefcase, and head out into the gray morning. Harrison Vance, the CEO of Vance Logistics, had been my North Star for a decade. He was a man of iron shirts and ironed principles, or so I thought. He was the one who handed me my first major account when I was still a nervous associate. He was the one who told me, over a glass of 20-year-old scotch, that a company is only as strong as the men who carry it. I took that to heart. I carried that company. I knew the name of every warehouse manager from Maine to California. I knew which shipping lanes were prone to fog in November and which unions were planning to strike in June. I was the person Harrison called at 2 a.m. when a cargo ship was held up in Singapore, and I always answered. The first clue. The shift happened during the hottest July on record. The air conditioning in the office was humming at full tilt, but the atmosphere inside felt cold. It started with a chair, a new ergonomic Italian leather chair that appeared in the office next to mine, an office that had been empty for 2 years. "Who's moving into 402? I asked Sarah, the receptionist, as I watched 2 movers carry in a mahogany desk. Sarah looked down at her computer, avoiding my eyes. "Mr. Vance's son is back from London, David. Harrison wants him involved in the day-to-day." I felt a slight prickle of unease, but I brushed it off. Harrison had mentioned his son Leo before. The boy had spent the last 5 years studying international markets, which mostly meant posting photos of yachts on social media. "He'll be an associate?" I asked. "Something like that," she muttered. That afternoon, Harrison called me into his office. The blinds were drawn, stripes of golden light cutting across his face. He looked older than he had a month ago, his hands slightly trembling as he adjusted his spectacles. "David, you've done a hell of a job with the Northeast expansion," he began, his voice the familiar gravelly baritone. "I've always seen a bit of myself in you, that grit, that hunger." "Thank you, Harrison. I'm just looking forward to the board meeting next month." "Right, the meeting." He cleared his throat and walked to the window. "Leo is coming on board. He's young, full of ideas, new school stuff, algorithms, automation, things I don't quite have the head for anymore. I want you to mentor Leo. Give him the keys to the kingdom for a bit. Let him see how the senior VP operates." He used the title, Senior VP. He dangled it like a carrot, and like a fool, I reached for it. "Of course, Harrison. I'll get him up to speed." But mentoring Leo wasn't like training any other hire. Leo arrived at 10 a.m. in a suit that cost more than my mortgage, smelling of expensive cigarettes and a vacation I couldn't afford. He didn't ask questions. He gave opinions. "Why are we still using this vendor for the Philadelphia hub?" Leo asked, leaning back in his new chair with his feet on the mahogany desk. "That old-school vendor has a 99% on-time record over 20 years, Leo said, my voice tight. "They know the drivers. They know the routes. Reliability is our product." Leo just smirked, tapping a rhythm on his desk with a gold pen. Reliability is boring, David. Profit is exciting. You're thinking like a worker. I'm thinking like an owner. He said it with such casual cruelty that I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at the door to Harrison's office, expecting him to step out and correct his son, but the door stayed shut. The next few weeks were a slow erosion. It wasn't a sudden landslide. It was more like watching a riverbank gradually crumble into the water. Leo didn't just sit in his office. He started appearing in meetings he wasn't invited to, sitting at the head of the table before I could even set my laptop down. He would interrupt my presentations with reimagined data, numbers that looked flashy on a slide, but had no basis in the gritty reality of the shipping industry. I noticed Harrison wasn't looking at me during those meetings, and he was looking at Leo, a strange mixture of pride and desperation in his eyes, as if he were trying to convince himself that his son was the genius he claimed to be. David, Leo tells me you're being a bit resistant to the new software integration, Harrison said to me one evening. We were the last two in the office, the only sound the humming of the vending machine down the hall. It's not resistance, Harrison, it's caution, I explained, rubbing the bridge of my nose. My head had been throbbing for 3 days straight. The software he's proposing hasn't been tested for cold chain logistics. If the temperature sensors glitch for even an hour, we lose $3 million in pharmaceutical cargo. We can't gamble on innovation that hasn't been vetted. Harrison sighed, a sound that seemed to age him 10 years. He walked over to the window, looking out at the fleet of trucks parked in the lot below. He's my son, David. He's the future of this name. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith to stay ahead of the curve. And what about the 10 years of faith I've given his company? I asked, the words out of my mouth before I could stop them. The silence that followed was suffocating. Harrison didn't turn around. He just stood there, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. You've been well compensated for your time, David. Don't let your ego cloud your loyalty. I walked out of that office feeling like I'd been slapped. My ego? I had missed my daughter's first steps because I was in a warehouse in Chicago. I had spent my 10th wedding anniversary on a conference call with a disgruntled supplier in Tokyo. My loyalty wasn't in question, but for the first time, I realized that Harrison's loyalty was a one-way street. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, the day of the official board announcement for the senior VP position. I had spent the entire weekend polishing the final expansion strategy. I had barely slept, fueled by a cocktail of caffeine and the sheer, desperate hope that my hard work would finally be validated. I arrived at the office early, my best suit pressed, my shoes shined. I saw Clara in the kitchen before I left. She had tucked a small note into my briefcase. I'm so proud of you. No matter what happens, you're our hero. I touched that note like a talisman as I walked into the boardroom. The board members were already there, whispering low tones. Harrison sat at the head, looking unusually stiff. Leo was next to him, wearing a smirk that made my stomach turn. Thank you all for coming, Harrison began, his voice lacking his usual resonance. As you know, the merger with Continental has created a need for a new senior VP of operations. We've looked at the data, we've looked at the future of the market, and we've made a decision. I sat up straighter. I felt the weight of 10 years of labor ready to be lifted. It is my pleasure, Harrison continued, not looking at me, to announce Leo Vance as our new senior vice president. The room went cold. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a roar that drowned out the polite applause from the board members, who were only there to collect their stipends. I looked at Harrison, waiting for the just kidding, waiting for the punchline. It never came. Leo has a vision for a digital-first approach, Harrison was saying, his voice gaining strength as he performed for the room. He represents the next generation of the Vance legacy. I didn't hear the rest. I was looking at Leo. He leaned back, interlacing his fingers behind his head, and winked at me. Not a friendly wink. You're beneath me wink. The meeting adjourned, and the room emptied until it was just me and Harrison. I didn't get up. I couldn't move my legs. David, Harrison said, his voice dropping into that fake sympathetic tone. I know this isn't what you expected, but Leo needs a strong right hand. We're doubling your current salary. We're giving you a new title, Chief Technical Consultant. You'll still be doing the work, but Leo will be the face. It's a win-win. A win-win? I whispered. I finally looked up at him. You're asking me to be the ghostwriter for your your son's career. You're asking me to do the heavy lifting while he takes the credit for a job he doesn't know how to do. I'm asking you to be a team player," Harrison snapped, his patience finally breaking. "I built this company. My name is on the trucks, my name is on the building, and now my name is on the VP's door. If you can't handle that, maybe you've outgrown your desk." He walked out, leaving me alone in the boardroom. The silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of hard work, it was the silence of a tomb. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the note from Clara. "No matter what happens," I realized then that I had been a team player in a game where the rules were rigged from the start. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't a successor. I was a tool that had served its purpose, and now I was being put back in the box so the owner's son could play with the toys. I didn't go back to my office. I didn't pack my pictures. I walked out of the building, the afternoon sun blindingly bright, and I didn't stop until I reached my car. I sat there for a long time, the engine idling, the air conditioning blowing cold and empty against my face. I wasn't crying. I was something much more dangerous. I was focused.
I didn't go home immediately. I couldn't face Clara and tell her that the hero she believed in had just been stepped over like a crack in the sidewalk. Instead, I drove to a quiet park by the harbor and watched the giant cranes unload shipping containers in the distance. For 10 years, those containers were my life's work. Now, they were just metal boxes owned by a man who didn't value me. I realized then that Harrison had made one fatal mistake. He thought the Vance name was the engine of the company. He didn't realize that the name was just the paint on the outside. I was the engine, and I was about to take my parts and leave. When I finally walked through my front door, the smell of the roast beef Clara had promised filled the house. It felt like a physical weight on my chest. I saw her in the kitchen, her face lighting up as she saw me. "David, you're early. Does that mean, did we get it?" I didn't say a word. I just walked over and held her. I held her for a long time, the silence in the kitchen stretching out until she understood. She pulled back, her eyes searching mine, her hand covering her mouth. "He gave it to Leo, didn't he?" she whispered. "He gave it to the name," I said, my voice sounding hollow even to me. "He offered me more money to stay and do the work while Leo takes the titles. He called it a win-win." Clara didn't cry. She didn't get angry. She just looked at the table I had spent so many nights away from. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to do exactly what Harrison taught me," I said, a cold clarity settling over me. "I'm going to look out for number one." The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in a decade. I called in sick. I sat in my home office with a legal pad and a pen. I didn't try to sabotage Vance Logistics. I didn't have to. Leo would do that all by himself. Instead, I started making a list. Not a list of clients. That would be a breach of my non-compete. I made a list of problems. The shipping industry is built on the last mile. It's the most expensive, most difficult part of the journey. Every major firm, including Vance, struggled with it. It was a niche, a headache that everyone tried to automate, but no one actually solved. "I'm starting a consultancy," I told Clara that night. "Deep Creek Logistics. We won't move the freight. We'll fix the bottlenecks that the big firms are too bloated to see." I resigned the following Monday. I didn't make a scene. I walked into Harrison's office, placed my badge on his desk, and handed him a one-sentence letter. "You're making a mistake, Harrison," not even looking up from his tablet. "Leo's about to sign the Continental merger. We're going to be the biggest player on the coast. You're walking away from the peak." "I'm not walking away from the peak, Harrison," I said quietly. "I'm walking away from the landslide." Leo was in the hallway as I left. He was wearing a new watch, a gold-rimmed thing that probably cost more than my first year's salary. "Good luck in the real world, Dave," he mocked, leaning against the water cooler. "Try not to get too much dust on that suit." "Good luck with the merger, Leo. I hope the AI knows how to talk to a dock foreman in a blizzard." The first 4 months of Deep Creek were brutal. I worked from the kitchen table until my eyes burned. I used my savings to hire 2 people. Sarah, the receptionist who had been fired for lack of enthusiasm shortly after I left, and Mike, a retired freight dispatcher who knew every back road in the country. We didn't go after Vance's clients. We went after the vendors Vance had started to ignore. Leo had implemented his digital-first approach, which meant he stopped taking phone calls from small-time regional carriers. He wanted everything through an app. But trucks aren't apps. When a tire blows
out at 3 a.m. on a mountain pass, you don't need a sleek UI. You need a human being who knows who to call. I spent my days in truck stops and small warehouses, listening. I heard the frustration. I heard the stories of Vance's missed payments and their automated service that left drivers stranded. Slowly, the word got out. If you have a problem that Vance can't solve, call Deep Creek. 6 months in, the landslide I had predicted began. It started with a missed shipment of medical supplies to a hospital in Ohio. Leo's software had optimized the route, but it hadn't accounted for a bridge closure that had been on the local news for weeks. The delay cost the client $500,000. Then came the bigger cracks. The Continental merger was stalling because the projected efficiencies Leo had promised the board weren't appearing. In fact, overhead was up 20%. I was sitting in my new, modest office, a converted brick warehouse with big windows and a small team of dedicated experts, when the phone rang. It wasn't a client, it was the front desk. "David, there's a man here. He says he's an old friend." I looked at the security monitor. It was Harrison. He wasn't wearing his bespoke suit. He was wearing a windbreaker, and he looked smaller, as if the air had been let out of him.
The door to my office didn't have the heavy mahogany thud of the Vance Logistics headquarters. It was a simple glass door that let in the natural light of the afternoon. When Harrison walked through it, he didn't command the room. He looked like a man who had been wandering in the rain and had finally found a porch to stand on. He stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. He saw Sarah, the receptionist he had let go, now sitting at a desk with 2 computer monitors, confidently directing a fleet of independent carriers. He saw the whiteboard covered in my handwritten logistics flows. He saw a team that was moving with purpose, a purpose he used to own. "You've built quite a little fortress here, David," Harrison said, his voice a ghost of the booming baritone I had feared for a decade. "It's not a fortress, Harrison. It's a workshop," I said, leaning back in my chair. I didn't stand up. I didn't offer him coffee. "What brings you to the real world today? I thought you'd be at the Continental victory party." Harrison flinched as if I'd struck him. He took a seat in the modest chair across from my desk, the chair reserved for truck drivers and small business owners. "The merger is falling apart," he admitted, his hands trembling slightly as he rested them on his knees. "Leo, he pushed the automation too fast. We've lost the confidence of the regional carriers. We have 40 containers of temperature-sensitive cargo sitting in a rail yard in Pennsylvania, and not a single driver will pick them up for us. They say our payment terms are unreliable, and our dispatchers are bots that don't listen." I crossed my arms. "And let me guess, the client is one of your biggest?" "It's the Stanton Group," Harrison whispered, "our oldest client. If we fail them on this delivery, they'll trigger the liquidated damages clause. It'll bankrupt the operations wing, David. It'll destroy everything my father and I built." "Where is Leo?" I asked. Harrison looked down at his shoes. "He's in London. He said he needed to clear his head to find a creative solution. He left me to handle the fallout." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. The future of the legacy had run away the moment the legacy required actual work, leaving the old man to beg the worker he had discarded. "I need Deep Creek to take the contract," Harrison said, looking up with raw desperation. "I'll pay whatever you ask. Subcontract the Stanton account to your firm. Use your people, your drivers. Just get those containers moving." I didn't give him an answer immediately. I made him wait. I let the silence stretch out, filled only by the rhythmic tapping of Sarah's keyboard in the outer office. I thought about the 10 years of dinners I'd missed. I thought about the win-win conversation. "I won't subcontract, Harrison." His face went pale. "David, please. I won't subcontract, but I will buy the Stanton contract out from under you, and I'll buy your regional licenses while I'm at it. You're hemorrhaging money, and the board is looking for a scapegoat. Give them the sale of the underperforming assets as a strategic pivot. It saves your skin with the board, and it gives me the infrastructure I need to grow." "You want to take my best client and my licenses?" Harrison asked, a flash of his old ego returning. "That's a hostile move, David." "No," I said, leaning forward. "A hostile move was giving my life's work to a boy who didn't know the difference between a pallet and a parcel. This is just a business transaction. Take it, or watch the Stanton Group sue you into the ground by Friday." Harrison stayed in that chair for an hour. He made 3 phone calls, 1 to his legal counsel and 2 to the board. By the time he stood up, the power dynamic had shifted forever. The paperwork was drafted by the end of the day. The public consequence didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened on the loading docks. 2 days later, I arrived at the Pennsylvania rail yard. I didn't send a manager. I went myself.
himself. Word had traveled fast through the CB radios and the driver lounges. When my black SUV pulled up, the drivers, the ones who had refused to move for Vance, were standing by their rigs, waiting. "Is it true, Dave? Are we hauling for Deep Creek now?" One of the veteran drivers called out. "You're hauling for me, and the automated payment system is gone. You'll have your checks by Friday, and you've got my personal cell number if the gate codes don't work." One by one, the engines roared to life. It was a symphony of diesel and steel. 40 trucks, once destined to sit idle under the Vance banner, began to roll out under mine. The story hit the local business journals the next morning. Vance Logistics sells key assets to former employees' startup. The industry knew exactly what it meant. It wasn't just a sale. It was an admission of defeat. The legacy was hollow, and the worker had become the owner. Leo Vance returned from London to find his office empty. Not because he was fired, Harrison couldn't bring himself to do that, but because there was nothing left for him to manage. The senior VP was now the head of a department with no trucks, no drivers, and no clients. I heard through Sarah that Leo tried to storm into his father's office to demand an explanation. Harrison didn't even look up from his desk. He just pointed to the door and said, "Go back to London, Leo. There's nothing left here for you to break."
The transition didn't happen overnight, but the momentum was unstoppable. Within a year, the brick warehouse that housed Deep Creek Logistics had become the nerve center of the region's shipping. We weren't just a consultancy anymore. We were the heartbeat of the local economy. I remember standing on the balcony of our new headquarters, a renovated space overlooking the very docks where I used to spend my lunch breaks dreaming of a VP title. The sun was setting, painting the harbor in shades of deep violet and burnt orange. Below me, the trucks moved like clockwork. They weren't just metal and tires, they were promises kept. Life at home had changed too. The hero Clara believed in hadn't just returned, he had found himself. I was still busy and the work was still hard, but the weight was different. It was the weight of a pack you choose to carry, not a yoke placed on your neck by someone else. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of birds instead of an alarm. I walked into the kitchen, and for the first time in 10 years, I didn't check my emails before saying good morning. "You're still here," Clara teased, flipping pancakes as our daughter Lily colored at the kitchen table. "I'm here," I said, pulling her into a hug, "and I'm staying for the soccer game this afternoon. I've already delegated the weekend shift to Mike." "I like this version of you, David," she whispered, "the one who owns his time." I did see Harrison one last time. It was at a charity gala for the Port Authority. He looked frail, the sharp edges of his personality softened by the reality of his diminished empire. Vance Logistics still existed, but it was a boutique firm now, a shadow of its former self. He approached me near the balcony, a glass of water in his hand. He didn't look at me with the coldness of a boss or the desperation of a beggar. He looked at me with the quiet respect of a man who finally understood what he had lost. "I hear Leo is in real estate now," I said, keeping the conversation light. "He's trying," Harrison said, a tired smile touching his lips. "He finally realized that in real estate, the dirt doesn't care who your father is. It just sits there until you move it." He paused, looking out at the city lights. "I'm sorry, David, for everything. I thought I was protecting a legacy, but I was just protecting a ghost." "The legacy is still there, Harrison," I said, gesturing toward the trucks moving in the distance. "It just changed names." We shook hands, a firm, honest grip, and I walked away. I didn't feel a surge of revenge or a thirst for more power. I just felt a profound sense of closure. I realize now that being passed over for that promotion was the greatest gift Harrison Vance ever gave me. If he had given me the title, I would still be sitting in that beige office, working 80 hours a week to make him richer, forever waiting for a thank you that would never be enough. He forced me to jump, and in jumping, I learned that I had wings. I look at my team now, people like Sarah and Mike, and I make sure they know their value every single day. I don't care about their last names or who they know. I care about the grit in their spirit, in the integrity of their word, because a company isn't a building or a logo. It's the collective soul of the people who show up when the world is asleep to keep the wheels turning. I've built my cathedral, and this time, the doors are open for everyone who is willing to do the work. So, I have to ask you, have you ever been told you weren't enough for a position you knew you were born to lead? Did you stay and try to prove them wrong? Or did you realize that the only person you needed to prove anything to was yourself? Tell me your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found your own path.